Hi, everybody. I'm Mr. Alsop, the 7th grade science teacher at South Lewis Middle School. I am here recording from my living room because, just like the rest of you, I'm doing a little bit of social distancing. And so, this is my way to keep in touch with my students so that they know what's going on and can get a little bit of science information. So, today we're going to talk about one of my favorite topics in science, and that is food. Now, we may not think about food and science together, but there is a lot going on with science and food and how those two things mix with each other. Hey, that's, well, uh, probably pretty accurate. Yeah, I do. Hey, now that's going a little bit too far. I don't know if I necessarily. Well, I suppose I probably do. I yeah, I like food. Um, but what I like even more than just food is food and science. So let's take a look at how those two things relate to each other, and let's take a look at some of the science that goes on behind your food. Now, some of you have probably already heard this saying, you are what you eat. And that's a saying that a lot of us hear when we're eating things that aren't healthy for us, and people are trying to say, hey, you better watch out for what you're eating because you could turn into a Twinkie. Um, I'm not really sure you're going to turn into a Twinkie, but the things that you eat do somewhat make up what you are. So today we're going to take a look at this science topic, and we're going to try to develop a model to describe how food works inside of us. So first up, we have to figure out what we get when we take apart food. Now, I am sure that there are some of you sitting around the house going, oh, yeah, I've seen that. I've seen what happens when I take apart food because I've seen it come back up again and I know what happens. But we're not talking about the physical process here. We're talking about the chemistry for what happens. What kind of chemical parts do we get when we take apart food? And that's really an interesting question because in order to understand it, we kind of have to know what food is really all made of. So what's in food? I mean, it's big. It's, a Twinkie or a cupcake or a cookie or a sandwich or a piece of pasta. All of those things are made up of something. They're made out of something in there, some kind of chemical, some crazy stuff. And what it all comes down to is when that food gets completely taken apart, we're left with one of two things. We're either left with a sugar or we're left with an amino acid. Now, out of those two things, they each do something a little bit different. So on the left side, we have our sugars. Now, our sugars give us energy. And when we break apart those sugars, we get the energy that's in those sugars. So when I eat that piece of pasta, you may not realize it, but that pasta is actually made out of sugars. They're just bound together in really long molecules. And so, because they're bound together in these really, really long molecules, they're very, very hard to break apart. And so, what we get is the little sugars that come apart as we break down that molecule over time. Now, on the other side, we have amino acids, and amino acids make up proteins. And a lot of the stuff that we eat, especially the meats that we eat, are made mostly out of proteins. Now, when they're in our body, we don't use the same exact proteins as other animals do. Other animals use different kinds of proteins to make up their muscles and make up their bodily tissues. Humans use different kinds of proteins to make up their muscles and their bodily tissues. But those proteins all come from the same building blocks, these same amino acids. So when we break down meat, for example, from a cow, which we call beef, when we break that meat down, what we get out of it are the amino acids that made up the proteins that made up that meat. Along with, inside of the meat, there are some fats, and those fats are going to break down and eventually give us the sugars that we're going to use for energy. So all of these things come from these two sides, the sugar side and the amino acid side. And those two sides combine to make up all of our food. And when we bring it into us and we start digesting it, we break it apart again so that we can use those in our own body to make up what our body is made out of. Now, as scientists, we have an interesting way to describe these with a chemical equation. And this is the equation for cellular respiration. It goes C6H12O6 plus 6O2 gives us 6CO2 plus 6H2O plus ATP, which, of course, everyone immediately looks at and turns off and goes, nope, I don't want to know. I don't think I think this might be a little too sciencey for me. But what's really going on here is a lot more simple. What's really going on here is that the sugar is being broken down to give us energy. The rest of that stuff are additional inputs and additional outputs into this equation that make the equation run more efficiently. In other words, they let us get more energy out of the sugar than we would if we just took the sugar and broke it down into energy. So the addition of that oxygen and the getting of that carbon dioxide and the water and the energy, it makes all of that work better when we use oxygen with it. So this sugar gives us energy when we break it apart. And so the important parts in here are the sugar and the energy. Everything else in there, you can save that for high school when you really have to learn all of these equations in really great detail. But for grade school and middle school, all we really need to know is the sugar side and the energy side, and how when we do that and we break it apart, it gives us back the energy. So what are we going to use all of that energy for? Because our body needs energy. What do we need energy for? Well, there's a lot of things your body needs energy for. Number one, it needs energy if your cells are going to do anything. For example, if your cells need to move for some reason, like your heart cells that are going to contract and cause your heart to beat, those cells need energy in order to keep contracting and keep moving. Other cells in your body might need energy to make enzymes that are going to break down things. All of those things come down to proteins again. So that's where we come back to the amino acids. Now, those amino acids, when we're looking at them, they make up all of these proteins that are in our body. So all of our body parts that are put together with these proteins that are made up of amino acids. And a lot of the energy that we use are used to put the amino acids back together in the right way to make the proteins that make up our bodies. So we eat the meat, we break the meat down, we get the amino acids out of the meat. We eat the sugars. We break the sugars down. We get the energy out of the sugars. We use the energy from the sugars to put back together the amino acids into different proteins, into human proteins that make up our bodies and that make up us. So in the end, your body uses those amino acids to make proteins, and those proteins are the building blocks of you. Now it's your turn. So what I want you to do this afternoon, once you get done watching this, is to take a look at how food gets broken down in the body and try to make a drawing of that. See if you can make a drawing of how food gets broken down. And you need to remember that you need to include some sugars, some energy, some amino acids, and some proteins, and try to see if you can make yourself a little model. Hi, everyone. This is Mr. Alsop coming to you from my luxurious living room studio. I am the middle school science teacher for 7th grade at South Lewis Middle School, and so I am here to give you guys a little lesson on cells. So we're going to talk a little bit about cells today, and we're going to talk about a bunch of other things too while we're talking about them. So let's take a look at a picture of a cell. So you've probably seen pictures like this. Don't worry too much about understanding all the little things inside of it. We'll try that another day and talk about all the things inside of a cell. But today, we just want to talk about what a cell is, and maybe where we can find some, and how we can see them, maybe. So that's what we're going to try to do today. Now, the first thing we have to know is what a cell actually is. So a cell, really, when we talk about it in science, is the smallest part of any living thing that's still living and a thing. Now, that seems a little weird because sometimes we can look at cells that are not living anymore. So we kind of have to change that definition just a little bit to say it's the smallest part of something that is living or that was once living. But some of you are probably already thinking, well, hey, wait, Mr. Alsop, I've heard of some stuff that's smaller than cells, so maybe you need to go back to college and learn a little more about science before you go going and talking to us. And that's true. There are some things smaller than cells. You've probably all heard of atoms, and atoms make up everything. And inside of atoms, you've probably learned about protons and neutrons and electrons, what we call subatomic particles. And then we have other things that are subatomic particles, things like quarks and muons and gluons that make up the protons and the neutrons and the electrons that are inside of the atom. So how is it that that stuff is smaller, but we say that cells are the smallest part of all living things? It's that living part that's the important part, or once living part that's the important part. Because other things that are out there, all of these other things that are not alive and that have never been alive, those things are made out of atoms, and many of them don't have any cells at all. So when we talk about atoms, it's not necessarily the smallest part of any living thing. It's just the smallest part of everything that is still that thing. For example, an atom of iron is still iron. Whereas when you get into protons, neutrons, and electrons, those protons, neutrons, and electrons can be part of any kind of atom. So they're no longer iron anymore. They're just a proton, a neutron, a electron. They could be a proton of anything. So atoms are the smallest part of anything that's still that thing. When you put a bunch of atoms together, you get molecules, which are smaller than cells. But again, those molecules are not always part of living things. Molecules can be part of things that aren't alive and that have never been alive. Like, for example, this tennis ball. This tennis ball is made out of atoms. It's made out of molecules. And wait, tennis balls. What are tennis balls made out of? Tennis balls are actually made out of cells. Uh-oh. Tennis ball is not a great example. Tennis balls, the outside of this is actually from a sheep. So this is wool from a sheep. So it was once on a living thing. So it's made out of cells. And underneath that is rubber. Rubber was once part of a living thing, came out of a plant. So there are cells. So technically this was once part of a living thing, which seems weird because it's tennis ball and the only living thing I've ever seen it in is my dog, because my dog carries it around all the time. But let's see. Do I have anything that is like that? Let's take a look. Let's see. Maybe we'll make this a little bigger, get a better look at it. This was never part of a living thing. This is a chunk of metal that fell out of the sky in a meteorite. So we know it was never part of anything living because it's iron and it never was in anything alive because we know that it was formed in the core of a star when that star exploded. So that is not a living thing. No cells in there. This might have some cells in it. So we have to be thinking about that when we're kind of thinking about these cells and where they're from and how they're made and all of that sort of stuff. And this is fun for us as scientists. We love to look at stuff like this and go, ooh, what's the smallest thing? Ooh, what's the definition for that? Oh, is that definition really right or not? As scientists, we always love to be wrong. We really like to see things in a different light. And when we're wrong, that's where we can make our best and most interesting discoveries. So scientists are always looking for a good opportunity to be wrong about something so we can discover something new that we didn't know before. So when we look back through these, we've got cells that are made out of molecules, molecules that are made out of atoms, atoms that are made out of subatomic particles, subatomic particles that are made out of sub-subatomic particles. Can we go up from there? What do cells make? So cells make tissues, which are just collections of cells that all get together and do the same thing. That thing up there that looks like a slice of ham, that is a muscle tissue. So it looks like ham because, well, it could be. I mean, I don't think it is. I think it's human. But so you probably wouldn't want to eat it. But it looks like a slice of ham because it's muscle tissue, and muscle tissue generally looks like that. That's what you eat when you're eating ham, is the muscle tissue from a pig. So tissues make up organs. Organs are things like your liver and your brain and all of that sort of stuff. Organs make up organ systems. When we put all of those organs together, we get a system like our digestive system or our nervous system. Organ systems, when you put them all together, you get an organism like a human. When you put a whole bunch of humans all in one place together, you get a population. A population is just a whole bunch of the same organism in the same area. And we can even go up from there. We can go from populations up to communities. In a community, we've got all of the different plants and animals that live in an area. Then we can go up to our ecosystems, where we have all of our living things, but also all of the non-living things that are around them, like the water and the rocks that they live on. Then we have the biosphere, which is all of the different ecosystems around the world. Then we have our planet, which just tells us that all of those biospheres together make up that planet. So we've got a bunch of organisms making a population, a bunch of populations making a community, a bunch of communities making an ecosystem, a bunch of ecosystems making a biosphere, a bunch of biospheres making a planet, and we can keep going up because that's the fun part about science. We can go from planets to solar systems, which are a whole bunch of planets going around a star. We can go from solar systems up to galaxies, where we get a whole bunch of stars in a big cluster all on their own. We can go from galaxies up to a universe, where we've got a whole bunch of galaxies making up that universe. We can go with a whole bunch of universes making up something we call a multiverse, where we have a multiple universe theory. And that maybe is the end of it, but we don't always know, because as scientists, we're always ready to be surprised, and we're always ready to find out, oh, we were wrong, that's not the top level, there's something up above that we didn't know about before. And so we have a lot of fun with that in science, and it's a really neat thing about science, is that we can always be wrong, and there can always be more things for us to discover. Now, when we look at all of these things, all of these different levels, what we're concerned with is the cells. So the cells are that level in there where it makes up the tissues that make up the organs, that make up the systems, that make up you. And so all living things are made up of cells. Some living things are made up of a lot of cells. Some living things are not made up of as many. So our question for today that we're trying to answer is, how can we prove that? How can we prove that we're made of cells? And this goes to a middle school learning standard on planning and conducting an investigation to provide evidence that living things are made out of cells, either one cell or many numbered of different kinds of cells. That. Can we see cells? Can we see cells by the seashore? Wow, that's hard to say. Can we see cells by the seashore? That's better. Can we see them? I can't see any cells there. I mean, I can see things that are made out of cells there. I can see the trees. I can even see like a little bird or something sitting on the water side. Those things are made out of cells, but I can't see their cells. Why can't I see their cells? Why can't you see your cells? Why can't you look at your hand and see your cells? Technically, you are seeing your cells, but you're not seeing a cell or an individual cell, or you can't point at it and go, ooh, that's a really interesting cell. Why can't we see them? The answer is there probably is a pretty good reason, and it's because they're really too small, except for that cell on the right. That cell on the right is a really big cell. It's the biggest cell on as far as we know, that we've discovered on Earth. That is a single-celled organism. That is one gigantic cell. It lives underwater. People call them sailor's eyeballs. They're really big single cells. On the left, though, is more typically what we think of when we think of cells. Those are plant cells on the left, and they are set up in a nice little pattern with their nice little cell walls and the things inside of the cells, and they look really neat. But you can't see that with your eyes just looking at them because they're too small to see just by looking. So how did we get to be able to see them? How do we know that they're there? How do we have any idea that these things exist? Well, in order to see them, we had to use an invention called a microscope. A microscope is the way that we see those little tiny cells that we normally don't have access to just using our own eyeballs. When you use a microscope, you're using lenses, which are pieces of glass that are built to focus things, like the lenses in my eyeglasses. And what they do is they make things look larger. And in the case of a microscope like the one up there, the microscope up there has multiple lenses in it. There are lenses that you look through, and then there's another lens that's right over the thing that you're trying to look at. And those two lenses together, when you take those lenses and you put them on top of each other like that, you don't just add them together, you multiply them. And we all know when you multiply two things together, you get way bigger things than if you add two things together. So by multiplying the power of those lenses, we can see things that are much, much smaller than we would normally be able to see. So with a microscope like this one, and hopefully you guys, when we get back to school, I'll be able to sit around in our classrooms and look through our microscopes. I'm really looking forward to it. I love looking through microscopes. And we'll be able to actually see these cells. So when we look, at first we might see something like this. This doesn't look like much. It's kind of a pink blob. Why doesn't it look like anything? Oh, I need to focus. So when you focus in, you can see things in much greater detail. And you can actually see the parts of a cell, and you can see the individual cells that you're looking at there. And by focusing in, you can get a really good look at those cells. So now we can see them. Now, when we look at these cells, we notice that they're all pink. But the earlier cells that we saw some green ones. And if I look in my next slide over here, we've got some purple ones and some green ones and some things that are almost clear. Why do they all have different colors? Why do they all look different? So the reason has to do a lot with how we look at things. If I take a look at this piece of wood here, this piece of wood here looks just kind of like whitish colored wood. There's nothing really special or interesting about it. But if I do something called staining, I can change the color of that piece of wood just a little bit. And so now the piece of wood that I have looks kind of brownish in color. And you can see that there are some differences in it that you couldn't see before. That's exactly what we do to these cells. We use something called a stain, which is the same thing that I used on that wood. We use a stain to change the color of the cells so that we can see them a little bit better. So looking at our cells now through our microscope with a little bit of stain, some of them turn pink, some of them turn green, some of them end up little kind of purpley cells, but they're all still cells. And this cell is the basic unit, the basic part, the most basic thing we can get on all living things. And they all look different. Like, these cells are kind of like, they look like they're like made from like a mathematics person. They're all straight lines and all squarey looking, and some of them look like triangles and pentagons, and they look like they belong in a math class. And these cells are all wild around the edges, and they look just kind of like big blobs, like the one on the left, or the one on the right looks like they're stringy bits. And that's because they all do different things. So each one of these cells is from something different. They come from different places and they do different things. The cell on the left is a cheek cell. It's a cell from the inside of someone's cheek. And it's just kind of a skin cell. It sits inside of your cheek and it tries to make sure that, the inside of your cheek, that if you are eating something, it doesn't, fall out of your mouth. Because if you didn't have cheeks, it would just fall out, and that would be weird and we'd all look like skeletons. And so we have these cells that make up our cheeks that hold all that stuff in our mouth. And its whole purpose is just to hold stuff in there and stretch. This muscle on the right is a muscle that's inside of your heart. And so it's long and stringy because it's pulling all the time, because your heart is beating. So it's constantly pulling on itself and pulling on the cells next to it. And it makes your heart beat. And so they look different because they're doing different things. And you'll notice that in the case of the cell on the right, it's with a whole bunch of its friends. And in the cell on the left, it's all alone because someone actually took it out of their cheek, away from its friends. So it's going to look a little bit different. Now, this cell here is a euglena. A euglena is an organism that's made out of a single cell. So it doesn't have more cells. It just has one. And that's okay. Organisms are different. Not everyone has to be the same. Some of us can have lots of cells, like humans. Some of us can only have one cell, like a euglena. And that's okay. It does everything it needs to do with just one little cell. And so that's one of the wonderful things about studying science, is we learn that there's a lot of difference out there. There's a lot of differences out there in the world, and they're all okay. Science shows us that there's so much out there and so many different ways we can explore it and so many different ways we can figure out what's going on, that it just opens everything up to us, especially if we're willing to take some chances and try out some things and have some experiments and do some interesting stuff. So the last thing I want to point out is that in science, we actually have words that go along with that idea of things only having one cell. There's a word called unicellular. Unicellular means that it only has one cell. And the opposite of that is multicellular. Multicellular means it has many cells. And you can see, if you look up in the top, there's a picture there of two people riding around on something called a unicycle. It's like a bicycle, but there's only one wheel. That's the same part, that uni part. The unicycle is like unicellular. The uni part of unicycle means one. The uni part of unicellular means one. So when we think about things like unicellular, only having one cell, we can think about things like unicycle, and maybe it'll make us remember about unicellular, because people on unicycles are funny, especially these guys, because they're playing hockey on unicycles, and that to me seems like a really cool made-up sport. So that's going to end what we wanted to talk about today. Can we prove that we're made of cells? We can, but I think we need to look at them underneath a microscope. For most of us, that means we're going to have to go back to school. And we're going to have to go to school, and we're going to have to ask our science teacher really, really nicely if we can look at some cells under a microscope. Because they're going to have a lot they want to get done before the end of the year, and I really hope one of the things they want to get done is looking at cells under a microscope. When we do this in school, one of the things that we use is we use a cotton swab, like a Q-tip, or sometimes even a toothpick, and just scrape some cells off the inside of our cheek. Then we put them onto a slide, and we put them underneath a microscope so we can look at them. If you have a microscope at home, you can try this. It's a really cool thing to do. If you don't have a microscope at home, wait until you get back to school and ask your science teacher real nice, and hopefully you'll get a chance to see some cells. Well, that's going to do it for us for today. I hope to see you guys again soon, and I will be looking forward to that. Thanks.